Welcome to the History Guy Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories of lesser-known historical events told by Lance Geiger, also known as the History Guy on YouTube. I'm Josh, your host, a writer for the channel and eldest son of the History Guy. We tell all kinds of stories about history from the modern era to the ancient past, so you never know what we're going to talk about next. One thing you can be sure of, it is history that deserves to be remembered. We at The History Guy are also excited to announce a new way to interact with the team and the History Guy himself at locals.com. Join the History Guy Guild for your one-stop location to chat with other history fans, get updates on the team, and more. You can join for free or pay as little as $5 a month to get access to live chats with the History Guy, looks behind the scenes, early access to ad-free videos, and more. Find us at historyguyguild.locals.com. We look forward to seeing you there. On today's episode, the History Guy tells the story of two foods, from their earliest origins to their contentious issues with government regulations. First is the story of sliced bread. Humans have baked bread for millennia, but automatically sliced bread is a relatively recent technology that nonetheless significantly altered society. Second, the History Guy talks about cranberries, specifically American cranberries, and what makes them unique, up until one of the first great food scares of the 20th century. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
There's archaeological evidence that people might have started to domesticate wheat as far back as 9600 BC, but the making of bread, which was originally made with wild grains, actually predates the domestication of wheat by thousands of years, and there's archaeological evidence that people might have been making at least some form of bread as far back as 14,000 BC. Bread was frankly central to the development of many important civilizations, and the humble loaf got a huge improvement in 1928 with the invention of the automatic bread slicer. But 78 years ago today, on January 18th, 1943, U.S. homemakers suddenly found their beloved sliced bread absent from store shelves, leading many to argue that the worst thing to happen since sliced bread was the day the government banned sliced bread. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The earliest forms of bread would have been flat breads. Flour, water, and salt were rolled into a dough and baked. Flat breads, according to a March 2018 edition of the Journal of Ethnic Foods, fit well into the context of a subsistence economy and are among the earliest processed foods. Flatbreads are so versatile, the journal notes, that they are still produced today. In fact, flatbreads can be produced both in the same way as they were made thousands of years ago and in modern fully automatic industrial lines, allowing tradition to meet innovation. It's unclear when the first leavened, or bread that used yeast to rise bread, was invented, but yeast was being produced by bread makers in Egypt by at least 300 BC. Early breads were made from a number of different types of grains. Bread in ancient Greece, for example, was most commonly made of barley. Loaves of bread could be purchased from baker shops in Greece as early as the 6th century BC, and bread was so central to the diet that the part of the meal aside from bread was a word that meant condiment, or bread's accompaniment. Bread was not only central to the medieval European diet, it was the primary way that meals were served, with meals up to the 15th century being served on a flat piece of bread called a trencher. As a diet staple, however, bread was occasionally caught up in world events. During the Great War, Britain faced bread shortages as they saw both a labor shortage due to the number of men going to war and the need to feed those troops, coupled with a German U-boat blockade that restricted imports. While the nation never actually rationed bread, it took a number of steps to address shortages and price, including regulating the use and extraction rates of various grains and mandating bread flour admixtures of barley, oats, rye, soya, or potato flour, resulting in a darker bread called war bread. The government supported voluntary rationing, leading to the somewhat questionable claim that Britain could defeat the U-boat by saving 2 thick slices of bread a day. Among the restrictions was a May 1917 ban on fresh bread that made it illegal to sell bread that was less than 12 hours old. While the so-called bread order had several rationales behind it, the most direct was the argument that people would eat less bread if they were forced to buy bread that was stale. In October 1917, a tailor named Louis Horowitz was sentenced to a substantial fine of 50 pounds, or 51 days in jail, for the horrible crime of purchasing new bread, although the Home Office decided that the penalty was too harsh and he was pardoned. Still, while commodities like meat and butter and cheese were all rationed during the war, the United Kingdom never officially rationed bread during the Great War. And it was between the wars that this ancient technology met the modern era. Otto Frederick Rohwedder was an Iowa-born inventor who, in 1916, was so convinced as to the economic potential of one of his inventions that he sold his chain of jewelry stores in order to finance its development. By 1917, he had both a working design and a factory in Monmouth, Illinois, ready to produce his marvelous new machine, only to have the machine and blueprints lost when the factory was destroyed in a fire. But by 1927, he had recovered and perfected his design for a new machine that would mechanically slice and then package to prevent from going stale a loaf of bread, enough to apply for a patent, which was finally granted in 1932. He sold his first machine to the Chillicothe Baking Company in Chillicothe, Missouri, which sold its first package July 7th, 1928. Rohwedder's son told a Chillicothe newspaper in 2003 interview that the product was so popular that the bakery increased its bread sales by 2,000% in just 2 weeks. The invention was well-timed, almost contemporary with the 1921 patent by Charles Strite of an electric toaster that toasted both sides of the bread simultaneously and would then eject the cooked toast, the first pop-up toaster. After thousands of years of slicing our own bread, people could now go to the store and buy pre-sliced bread, an innovation that was so convenient that the sales of bread skyrocketed along with the sales of spreads like jams and jellies and peanut butter. By 1933, sales of sliced bread exceeded sales of unsliced bread. No one ever seems to ask what was the greatest thing before sliced bread, but we know that today everybody competes to who has the claim to be the best thing since. But sliced bread was about to run into the largest war in human history. The U.S. government took on an unprecedented level of control over the economy during the Second World War. Among the agencies created was the War Production Board, which directed the conversion of industries from peacetime work to war needs, allocated scarce materials, established priorities in the distribution of materials and services, and prohibited non-essential production. And the Office of Price Administration, which had the power to set price ceilings and to ration scarce supplies of items, including tires, automobiles, shoes, nylons, sugar, gasoline, fuel oil, coffee, meats, and processed foods. A wide array of goods were rationed during the war, from gasoline to typewriters to lard. This was accompanied by numerous regulations. For example, if you wanted to buy a new tube of toothpaste, you had to turn the old tube in for recycling. On January 18th, 1943, the long reach of regulating the war economy finally came for sliced bread. Claude R. Wickard, the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, issued Food Distribution Order No. 1 in conjunction with a War Price Administration order allowing a 10% increase in the wholesale cost of flour. The order banned the sale of pre-sliced bread, as well as placing restrictions on the types of bread that bakers could bake. The Times advocate of Escondido, California, explained, "Bakers who deal in retail sales to consumers are allowed to bake only 15 varieties of bread, including rolls. Not more than 3 shall be white bread, and rolls will be limited to 9 varieties. 3 types of wheat bread may be baked." The regulation was promulgated quickly, leaving many surprised. The Chicago Tribune noted on January 19th that the government ban on the sale of sliced bread yesterday caught hundreds of Chicago housewives by surprise and sent them scurrying to hardware stores to raid depleted supplies of bread knives. While just a generation before had grown up without sliced bread, the loss of the product was sort of a crisis in 1943. The Lodi News Sentinel of Lodi, California, noted the day the regulation became effective. "Now, if we view this operation with a jaundiced eye, you will have to forgive us. Have you sliced a loaf of bread recently yourself? Have you a bread slicer in the home, for that matter? Do you think, providing you that slicer, that you can turn out slices the same degree of accuracy as they come from the baker? The answer probably is no, to all questions." The News Journal of Wilmington, Delaware proclaimed, "No official questionnaire has ever been issued, but it is believed that the majority of American housewives are not proficient bread slicers." The Chicago Tribune described the scene. Bakery clerks reported that some of the housewives were resigned. Others, still uncomprehending, stalked out of stores to look further for cut bread, and a few flexed their cutting arms in a manner one proprietor described as trouble and plenty of it. By January 24th, the Cedar Rapids Gazette noted that instead of the regular half-inch sections which came from the bread wrapper, shapeless, odd-sized sections of bread found their way to dinner plates. Certainly the law had its detractors. The Times of San Mateo, California summarized the problems. Bread knives were hard to get. When you got them, it took time to learn how to use them, and after that it took more time to slice the bread daily. If the knives were too dull, they wouldn't cut, and if too sharp, they took a toll on fingertips. And the time lost and injuries resulting cost the nation many a man or woman hour. And besides, no matter how you sliced them, it seemed the hand-carved chunks still got caught in the toaster. A woman named Sue Forrester wrote in a letter to the editor in the January 26th edition of the New York Times, "I should like to let you know how important sliced bread is to the morale and saneness of a household. My husband and 4 children are all in a rush during and after breakfast. Without ready sliced bread, I must do the slicing for toast. 2 pieces for each one. That's 10. For their lunches, I must cut by hand at least 20 slices, for 2 sandwiches apiece. And afterwards, I make my own toast. 22 slices of bread to be cut, in a hurry. The Chicago Tribune reported that both retail and wholesale bakers here described the ban as a doubtful saving of time and labor cost, a waste of bread, and a duration long lost of an investment in slicing machines. But the response was not universally negative. Much of the response represented the sort of stoic bravery with which the nation, and in fact the world, faced wartime necessity. Mrs. Doris H. Steele, a home demonstration agent, wrote in the Barry Times of Barry, Vermont, "In Grandmother's day, the loaf of bread had a regular place at the family table. Grandmother had an attractive board for the bread to stand on and a good sharp knife alongside. Grandmother knew that a sharp knife and a steady hand were the secrets of slicing bread. She sliced as the family asked for bread, and in this way she didn't waste any bread by cutting more than the family could eat. Let's all contribute to the war effort by slicing our own bread." The Miami News of Miami, Florida ran a story January 24th entitled "Miami Housewives Renew Art, Almost Lost, of Bread Slicing," that described how many housewives were coping. Mrs. M. Helper, for example, said, "I don't know what it's all about, but it doesn't bother me very much because I already have a nice, sharp bread knife. I guess we'll all get along as best we can." While Mrs. R.A. Oglesby responded, "I haven't been buying any bread since the order to stop slicing it came out. I don't have a bread knife and I can't find one to buy. So I'm baking biscuits and buying rolls." Even the Lodi News Sentinel, after expressing how dubious they were and proclaiming "we don't like the order," then framed it as being among 101 merchandising frills which we have taken for granted. They're all on the way out, because all of them mean extra work for someone, and that extra work could be better applied in wartime to doing something that helps win the war. Concluding, "Bring on the unsliced bread. We'll manhandle it the first few days. After a week or so, maybe we'll get some slices out of it. They won't be works of art, but they'll be bread. And the bread is the important thing, isn't it?" And at least one person cheered the restriction. The St. Cloud Times of St. Cloud, Minnesota noted that actress Olivia de Havilland, who hadn't been reading the papers and didn't know that sliced bread was a war casualty, was delighted to hear it. She said firmly that steps should have been taken long ago because bread was always sliced too thick, and it was about time the government stepped in. Still, the law had its powerful critics. New York City Mayor Fiorella LaGuardia, an ally of President Roosevelt and director of the Office of Civil Defense, argued in a radio address on January 24th that bakeries who already own bread-cutting machines should be allowed to use them. But the government did not relent. In fact, the New York Times reported on January 26th that the ban was going to be extended to local bakeries, delicatessens, and stores that continued to use their bread-slicing machines. John F. Conaboy, the New York area supervisor of the Food Distribution Administration, explained that the extension was necessary to protect regular bakers against unfair competition. The exact reasons for the ban were never clear, but several were suggested. First, the regulations were intended to provide savings and reduced overhead, which it was hoped would allow bakers to absorb the increased cost of bulk flour without raising the price of bread. A second reason had to do with saving war supplies. The government argument was that sliced bread had to be double wrapped with heavy wax paper, since sliced bread dries out and goes stale more quickly. Thus, the order saved both wax and paper. The order also might save critical war materials like steel needed to manufacture and repair the machines and the energy used to operate them. Some speculated that the order may also have been intended to reduce bread consumption, on the reasoning that pre-sliced bread had increased consumption, so eliminating it might result in a corresponding decrease. This could allow Secretary Wickard to avoid bread rationing, which would have been unpopular. Finally, some argued that eliminating slicing meant less waste, as whole loaves do not dry out as quickly and were less likely to mold in moist environments. And all the reasoning, frankly, failed. Many bakers argued that sales did decrease for a number of reasons, but the general idea is that the order caused more bread waste, not less. The Akron, Ohio Beacon observed waste resulting by consumers cutting slices either too thick, too thin, or discarding leftovers. The Chicago Tribune pointed out that sliced bread actually lasted longer because a housewife opens one end of the sliced bread, generally replaces the heel after taking out what she wants, and the bread stays fresh. To cut it herself, she removes the whole wrapper and the bread dries out more quickly. The Beacon opined, it's a crime to waste food, especially during wartime. The Charlotte Observer noted that war production regulations already prohibited purchasing new bread-cutting machines, so the savings in steel would only be the tiny amount that would be used in the repairs of existing machines. In fact, the order might have had the opposite effect. As the newspaper observed, the order has sent housewives scurrying into markets to buy new knives for slicing bread. Bakers had already argued that the order produced no real cost savings. The Chicago Tribune quoted a spokesman for a large wholesale bakery that said that time saving in the industry was negligible, and the Charlotte Observer estimated savings to be less than 1/10 of 1 cent on each loaf. The Harrisburg, Pennsylvania Telegraph reported February 17th. Above all, the bakers admit the purpose for which the bread slicing ban and other bakery regulations were instituted have been defeated, and instead of affecting a saving, a cost to the bakers, have increased. That the ban was ill-considered from the start was most evident in the fact that it was lifted less than 2 months after taking effect. The Chicago, Illinois Suburbanite Economist wrote on March 10th, "By permission of Secretary of Agriculture Wickard, sliced bread went back on sale yesterday. Mr. Wickard said he had found there were more evils in stopping the slicing of bread by the bakers than in letting them go ahead and do it. Turns out there was no reason to save wax paper, as bakers already had ample supplies on hand, and wheat was also not an issue due to a bumper crop the year before." In fact, in the wake of the reversal, suddenly no one seemed willing to take responsibility for the ban to begin with. The Belvedere, Illinois Daily Republican proclaimed, "Sliced bread ban bears earmarks of who done it." The Office of Price Administration put the baby on the Agriculture Department's doorstep. An Agriculture Department spokesman said it was really the baking industry's idea. The bakers, said a spokesman for the American Bakers Association, were much excited. For their part, War Production Board officials said that so many things have happened in the past 2 months that they couldn't remember who started the no-slicing idea. The Columbus, Indiana Republican reported that in Washington, none of the powerful war agencies wanted to take credit for the sliced bread ban order, and it begins to appear that the little man who wasn't will ultimately get the credit. The OPA says, "I didn't do it." The WPB answers similarly, and Secretary of Agriculture Wickard says he had no part in it. Indiana Representative Forrest Harness said in the Indianapolis Star, "I blame the little bureaucrat in the Agriculture Department rather than Secretary Wickard for the silly order making an offense for the baker to sell sliced bread. Certainly forbidding sales of sliced bread wouldn't win the war." In the end, the story of the 1943 sliced bread ban was one of bureaucratic overzealousness. As Culinary Lore magazine noted in 2017, the ban on sliced bread probably was never given any real thought or analysis, and it didn't last very long. Despite the ban having its supporters at the time, the reversal less than 2 months later resulted in almost universal approval. The San Mateo, California Times proclaimed, "Man cannot live by bread alone. He wants it sliced." Mrs. James P. McLaughlin was quoted in the Chicago Suburbanite. "So now we have our ready sliced bread back, and everybody's just a little bit happier. Everybody, that is, except for the sparrows." And Miss Dorothy Merton said in the Detroit Free Press, "I was plenty glad when the OPA decided to lift the ban on bread slicing, because I hadn't had a good piece of toast in weeks." And the best lesson, maybe, is that even in difficult times, we should appreciate what we have. Because no matter the challenges of the day, at least we still have sliced bread.
Now's the part of the episode where we get to chat with the history guy. A little bit about what we just heard, what we're going to hear, and some behind-the-scenes stuff you only get to hear about on the podcast. We'd also like to welcome back Betty Jo, the history mom and my grandmother. So now we know, if anyone asks, just how long ago it was that sliced bread was invented.
We do. Yeah, that was, I used to joke on that. Everybody says, what's the coolest thing since sliced bread? But, what was the coolest thing before? But then everybody was noting that the late Betty White, who just passed this last year, that she was actually born before the invention of sliced bread. So that she was the greatest thing. Sliced bread is the greatest thing since Betty White, is the way that they put it. But it's relatively, and that's an interesting kind of sub-theme in this video, is that how quickly the technology changed. I mean, it's about, the Second World War and rationing and stuff like that. But I mean, one of the things that's startling in there is I said their grandmother, lived without a bread slicer. And then all of a sudden, housewives could not figure out how to slice bread. I mean, we forgot how to slice bread over the course of that single generation because the machine was invented. And that's how, when someone asks, what's the coolest thing since sliced bread, that's why. Sliced bread is so important that we literally forgot how to slice bread.
I think it's really interesting, though, that that they had to have knives for something else, and so they didn't use the turkey knife to slice the bread, apparently.
Yeah, you need apparently it's a different knife, yeah. And they didn't, they weren't prepared enough so that they immediately ran out of knives at places like hardware stores because they hadn't prepared for the run on bread knives that would come. I don't know that I have a bread knife.
I don't know that I have one either. That would be specifically that.
Oh, what's it look like?
I'm pretty sure I do have a knife that is at least referred to as the bread knife. Now, whether it is a bread knife I don't know. I'm not exactly sure what differentiates them, but it does seem like they didn't warn anyone about, that you were suddenly not going to be able to have sliced bread.
Yeah,
I figured that would be
startling. Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe happened a lot with some of the rationing, but I mean, this one was particularly unique, and it really has to do too with I mean, that's the real part of the story. This is that we were so used to rationing, we were so used to sacrificing, that something that really made no sense, that no one could explain, that in the end no one would claim. I mean, no one would even claim responsibility for, and they could just tuck through because they were just just used to saying that, and it was so. I mean, who knew the amount of disruption that would come over that particular rule. And it says a lot about the war, but I mean, part of it was bread is different than almost anything else. If you were rationing bread and milk, then you're in a desperate situation. I mean, people figure those are things you need to survive. And so the governments, both in the UK and the US, were desperate not to ration bread. And so these were just kind of weird ways to ration bread. In the US, we said you could only make 3 kinds of rolls and 2 kinds of bread. And that was to try to move to other kinds of flours. But it was also simply to make bread something that consumers wanted less. And in the UK, they said you had to buy stale bread. I mean, it became a crime to buy bread that wasn't stale. So it's kind of funny that it went through, and we didn't even know what kind of a crisis it would be. But I mean, it was part of the, just thinking that says, well, we don't want to ration bread. So how do we get consumers to self-ration bread? And apparently that's one way. I like the lady that said, I'll just buy rolls.
But the other thing that it really emphasizes is the fact that any regulation, no matter how simple it seems or how harmless it seems, can cause so many repercussions. And it's the same that we see every day in our lives, and is really something you have to realize is, yes, it does make a difference, even if you just tell them you can't have a bread slicer. And this one turned out not to make sense. I didn't mean for these 2 episodes to come out to be like anti-regulation, because you got to have some sorts of regulations. But they are signs. It's always a line you're trying to draw, and this was an interesting line. Even in the war, when people were willing to sacrifice, this was just a meaningless sacrifice. But to their credit, I mean, it took them about a month to figure out that the blowback was bigger than whatever savings they thought they might get. And then everybody's like, it wasn't my idea. Was it your idea? They didn't even find someone to throw under the bus. They just drove the bus away. Pretended it never happened.
It really is, for the number of things that people were willing to ration on and to make sacrifices for. This was the line. That's what we found out, is that the line was sliced bread.
Yeah.
People.
Well, I mean, the poor lady talking about how many pieces she needed just to make breakfast, and you're like, wow, But I mean, why? If you're gonna ration bread, that's one thing. But I mean, the bread you can't, hasn't been sliced. I mean, it was one that was always kind of difficult to understand. It's interesting because there were newspaper articles that were trying to justify it, like any other of the regulations, and even they were clearly struggling on whatever the reason was, because no one ever really wrote down a reason. Someone just it's like someone jotted that down as a joke to see if it would get through, and it did.
Yeah, and they couldn't find out who, because literally no one was willing to say, yeah, I'm the one who said you can't have sliced bread.
Yeah, even more. I mean, they were all like, no, not me. Wasn't me. I had nothing to do. They ran away from that. Yeah. And it does, it says something about what we need to appreciate in the modern world. For all the complaints that we had, we're facing some shortages now, which the nation really hasn't seen since maybe the Second World War. But I mean, coming in and having fewer choices of antiperspirant or whatever that's up on the in your shelves is a lot different. I mean, we are so spoiled now. I mean, can you imagine, for all the complaints that we had during COVID and et cetera, can you imagine if suddenly the bread wasn't sliced? I mean, how many of us could even vaguely figure out how to turn a loaf of bread into a sandwich?
I have very rarely had to try to cut just a loaf of bread into sandwich slices. And I can't cut a straight line through a slice of bread to save my life. I mean, I can't.
It's hard
even
to do.
when I'm cutting like banana bread, it's going to be shaped like a wedge, which is fine if I'm eating it like that. But with a sandwich, and if you're trying to toast it, and that's not something I had really considered. But we really rely on the size of the bread.
It's
in
astounding.
Order to fit in the
toasters had just come out and was breaking the toasters because the bread wasn't the right size. I mean, it's crazy to think about. I mean, one of the lessons really that I've learned as the history guy is that if we think we have it bad now, someone's always had it worse. And I can't imagine the crisis. And during COVID, the people were baking bread at home more because they were stuck at home and they had a yeast shortage because suddenly people didn't realize everybody would start in the same way they're having toilet paper shortages and can shortages and whatever. So I mean, there is a lot of kind of echoing of things that we've seen here, but it also goes back to that general idea that was. I mean, we're talking about a time when people were so used to sacrifice that they fully accepted this, really silly regulation that made no point at all. And certainly they were in we have lived through much worse than we live through today.
including going from the greatest things in sliced bread to not having sliced bread all of a sudden. I mean, it was crazy.
It's incredible that in 15 years, 1928 is when they first start marketing sliced bread, 43 is when they ban it, that how completely people had come to rely on pre-sliced bread.
Yeah. So that they were utterly unable, except for Olivia de Havilland. She was apparently perfectly happy slicing her own bread. She's
like, they're too thick.
Yeah. It was really funny to pull out. So it's an interesting story, and it's certainly a story about how much we have to appreciate. Well, I mean, whatever's going on today, you can buy sliced bread at the store, right?
Well, and one of the things that interesting in my business, because I own a magazine, is the fact that there's a shortage of paper. And if you look it up, you'll realize that the paper they use in magazines, most of it comes from overseas. And so basically, who would ever think that when a printer calls me and says, I'd like your business, my printer said, hey, be careful, be sure and ask if they have paper.
If they have paper.
That's the important part, is whether, and it's interesting because you don't necessarily expect the repercussions that there are. And I think even more since World War II, the global economy has become so tied up in so many different things.
Seeing that. The baby formula shortage, the children's Tylenol shortage that we've been hearing things about and things like that. Those are the sliced bread of the day, where we're really startled to find out how one or two things that are very well stocked supermarkets that we need to appreciate. That just one or two things not being there can truly impact people's lives. So I guess this is sort of a cautionary tale about that too.
Yeah, COVID was one of the first times, I mean, in my life that you'd been walking into a store and really see, I mean, whole shelves empty of certain things, and it's interesting how spoiled that really makes us. Because I mean, I've lived in a world where there was always plenty. I always could have gone and gotten any number of these things, and to be fair, mostly I still could have gotten at least something. I remember like our favorite brand of Alfredo pasta sauce wasn't somehow that became a victim of the supply chain problems or something. And yet, I mean, it's not like we couldn't get Alfredo sauce, we just couldn't get the one we liked the most. And that's that's an interesting way to think about it, on how much it's changed.
At a time when we were literally rationing what food you could get, what sugar you could get, and that rationing included just literally turning off the bread slicers.
Yeah, we might be seeing something. That there's a factory in China that makes all the iPhones that's going through all kinds of crazy stuff, which is directly because of Chinese COVID policies, and I wonder what that's going to be like.
Yeah, new iPhone for you. There'll be an iPhone shortage. That'll be
an iPhone shortage, right? And yet, I think when you think back on it, maybe iPhones aren't the most important thing, and yet I bet that'll be a problem for some people.
Oh yeah.
There will be way more demand.
The vast bulk of my life was lived before the iPhone, and now I'll be like, I don't know what I'll do without an iPhone. How do you know what time it is? Yeah,
exactly, right? And that's we've come to rely on stuff, and to some extent, I mean, that kind of looks like the bread too, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't that long ago that we were all living lives without cell phones and constant connection to the internet, and now I sit here and think, what on earth did people do in the 1980s?
Yeah.
What did they do with their day?
How did we survive this? You went to the mall. We don't have them anymore.
Yeah, it's funny to me to think about that, because gosh, if the internet goes out, I'm like, oh, that's okay. I've got data on my phone or whatever. Like, there's no way to keep me. It's very difficult to get us totally disconnected these days.
And I remember life with a corded phone. I remember my first cell phone. I mean, it was a packet that you zipped open. I used it for 3 minutes the first year that I owned it. I billed 3 minutes. Because you didn't want to use the thing.
Yeah, you didn't want to use the.
Yeah, now, gosh, I don't know how many hours are spent on the phone. Where would the history guide be? Where would the podcast be if people didn't have these ways to listen to it? So, but I mean, this is another good example of how good we have it, because whatever our complaints, we still got sliced bread, right? Yeah.
If they make me slice my own bread, that's my line. I refuse. Yeah. I'm with everybody back in 1943. I'm going to be like, no, come on.
I'll just have like a square chunk of bread and a can of tuna, and I'll just take a bite of each one at a time. There's no way I'm making a sandwich.
Or just
I'm with
go
the lady
rolls.
who just bought rolls. Yeah. I can make a sandwich out of a roll. I can cut a roll in half. I can do that.
It is truly incredible how much it changed, and how much it says about the American society in terms of not just how fast things can change, but where our lines are and stuff like that.
Where it is, yeah.
And I think
you saw very little rebellion in the Second World War.
Yeah.
To all, there was some Union stuff and other, but I mean, you saw very little rebellion. But you saw a large housewives' rebellion to the slice, that the bread wasn't sliced, and it's interesting to see where the line was drawn. I mean, we can ration fuel, we can ration sugar, but darn it,
Well,
we can't slice our bread.
And the interesting thing is that the women drew the line.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You don't hear no men in there complaining.
No.
That does say something about the culture too.
Because they didn't slice bread.
Men didn't slice bread. That's true. That was
they weren't
we
the
figured
ones.
out who in American society was responsible for slicing the bread.
When they talked about things that could have done possibly to help things, I'll admit that when you think about it long at all, you're like, yeah, I don't really understand what this could have saved exactly. It doesn't seem like they thought it through in terms
they
of
thought
exactly.
maybe wax paper. I mean, there was some
Yeah.
argument, or maybe there would be some parts involved in repairing. But when you got the bread slicer, it doesn't cost much to run it. It appeared that they actually had a good significant amount of wax paper. But the other thing that happened is that we did have bumper crops of wheat. And so that there wasn't a bread shortage. So it might honestly have been something as, I mean, when the UK said that you can only buy stale bread, I mean, the point with that was that that they were trying not to ration bread by making bread less desirable.
Yeah.
So the original thinking might be that if we had a poor wheat yield, what we really needed to do was to get people less interested in eating bread. And maybe, that faded when it looked like we were going to have plenty of bread and plenty of wheat.
Yeah. Ultimately, this one, it came out and they couldn't even come up with particularly defensible reasons.
Yeah. When they started getting complaints, everybody's like, okay, who's in charge of justifying this one? And everybody's like, I don't know, I thought you did it.
That one just went on through. We didn't even really realize it was in the paper. But yeah, it's because they weren't saving much on steel or anything like that. They had already banned buying new machines, which would have thought, because that's like the compromise. Like, oh well, maybe they could have just said, oh, I can't buy new machines. But if you've already got a bread cutter, no, they'd already done that. That wasn't even part of the conversation.
Yeah, no, Figueroa said, oh, obviously it doesn't apply to delis that are making sandwiches, and then the government says, oh, sure it does, and so now you can't buy a sandwich.
All of a sudden,
they have to slice the sandwich at the deli with a knife rather than cut it with a. Yeah, it was. You can see why people just started crossing their eyes, and you can see why that could be such a threat, because once you step across the line, then people will start to question the other rationing as well.
Yeah,
that could have been bad. But I mean, then it's another story too about how the nation pulled together during the war in a way that's it's almost hard to imagine now. I mean, can you imagine if we really started rationing anything now, even during COVID, if we really started actually like rationing, like you had to have ration coupons, how with all the controversy that we had over everything else in COVID, how controversial that would have been.
Yeah, it does seem hard to imagine that we could go back to that. And I don't know. I mean, maybe if it comes to a situation where we have to, I think we tend to surprise ourselves. But it's
well, at least we'll know that
definitely...
we've managed before. Our grandmothers did it. Our great grandmothers did it. We can do it.
Magellan TV is sponsoring this episode, and they sponsor all of our podcasts. And if you've listened to the podcast, you know that what we like to do is talk about what we've been watching on Magellan TV lately. And so what have you been watching on Magellan TV?
Mom's here. That's who you're in the background, obviously. So we were just clicking through, and so we chose a documentary called Dollywood or Bust. And I have to say, honestly, that I've never been to Dollywood, and I don't quite get Dollywood. Honestly, this is the craziest documentary I've ever seen on Magellan, because it was a British documentarian who clearly had no understanding whatsoever of what they were doing there in the Smoky Mountains. He didn't have any idea who Dolly Parton was. His only understanding of her was that she had a big chest, which is interesting because they won't emphasize that at Dollywood because it's a family park. And so he didn't quite understand why people were going there. So it was not just fun because it really does tell the story of this amusement park and why the people are there and the people that love it. But it also was certainly a study in cross-cultural studies, right? I mean, in that, boy, he didn't think highly of the U.S., and that came through. But on the end, when they handed him the turkey leg, he ate it.
I've been to Dollywood. My husband and I went. My late husband and I were there. We were amused because when we paid the fee for the parking ticket, thought this is really expensive, and then we realized that was only for parking, and then we had a door to get in. We thoroughly enjoyed it. They have a little bit of everything, including one of the things he was really confused about was that there's a chapel there, and that a lot of people go in and spend a half hour in listening to church music and into prayers and that type thing. But seriously, what it's done in that area in Pigeon Forge and Gatlinburg and so forth is absolutely astonishing because it's just changed that entire area. But no, I highly recommend Dollywood. It is just fun. And the Englishman, he liked the food. and he certainly seemed to enjoy the dancers, but he was totally confused of why anybody would think that was, and I suppose it doesn't fit the English idea of entertainment.
If you want to shock a European friend who's trying to understand American culture, I think Dollywood is a great place to do it. I think that can leave people just cross-eyed. And it just reminds me of all the crazy stuff. I mean, you can see anything on Magellan TV, and this is not typically what you would pull out because it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek documentary. But actually, it just shows how awesome Magellan TV is, and it was a fun watch. I tell you what, I learned more about Dollywood than I knew about. I think people who've been to Dollywood have learned things about Dollywood.
I did too.
So what have you been watching on Magellan TV?
Me and my wife watched a nature documentary, and it's called Knute and His Friends, and it tells the story of 3 different bear families, essentially. Knute is the main one, and he's a baby polar bear born in Berlin. He was the first cub born in Berlin, in the Berlin Zoo in 30 years, and so he was a big deal. But his mom abandoned him, and so this zookeeper has to raise Knute. Tell you what, baby polar bears are cute.
Polar bears are cute. I love that. I mean, Magellan TV, you get a lot of great nature documentaries, and baby polar bears are cute.
Yeah, this was mostly cute. It is, of course, it's a nature documentary. It pulls at your heartstrings because it tells the story of 2 other families of bears too that are out in the wild, and they have struggles and bad things happen to animals sometimes. So, but it was really quite heartwarming too to see how these animals, and you get attached to them and how their little lives go on, and they've all got names, and of course you start rooting for them when they're having problems and stuff. So it's a very, very enjoyable documentary, and it's called Knute and His Friends. It's a great example of the breadth of kind of stuff that you can watch on Magellan, is that you can go from watching
Dollywood or Bust, that's what it was called, which I'm sure the pun was intended, and to Knute and Friends. Yeah, it just shows the breadth of what you can do. I mean, I love Magellan TV. It is always something fun to watch on Magellan TV.
And of course, if you are a listener or watcher of The History Guy, you can always go to try.magellantv.com/historyguy, where we will always have a deal for you. Sometimes a free month, or a deal on an annual membership, or even a documentary that you can watch for free. Again, that's try.magellantv.com/historyguy. Next up, The History Guy tells the story of the Great Cranberries Scare. And stay tuned after the episode to hear us chat a little more with The History Guy.
The history of U.S. regulation of domestically produced food and pharmaceuticals goes back to the end of the 19th century, and a pioneering researcher named Harvey Washington Wiley, who was the chief chemist of the Department of Agriculture's Division of Chemistry. And from those early beginnings, a regulatory environment developed in fits and starts over time as consumers and government and industry tried to develop the best way to protect the nation's food supply. And one of the first great tests of that regulatory environment came in 1959, when a new regulation ran into a venerable product and resulted in what has been described as the nation's first great food scare. The Great Cranberry Scare of 1959 changed the way Americans looked at their food, trusted their government, and consumed their cranberries. It's history that deserves to be remembered. Born in 1844, Harvey Wiley was a Civil War veteran who had degrees in both medicine and chemistry. He was offered the post of chief chemist for the Department of Agriculture in 1882, largely because of his expertise in the chemistry of sugar, as the department was interested in growing a U.S. sugar industry based on sorghum. In the position, Wiley started conducting research into the adulteration and misbranding of food and drugs on the American market, including so-called poison squad studies, where the effects of a diet consisting in part of the various preservatives were tested on human volunteers. The studies and subsequent publications moved the public, including a campaign where 1 million U.S. women wrote the White House and spurred Congress to pass the landmark Consumer Protection Act called the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, also called the Wiley Act. For his contributions, Wiley was popularly called the father of the Pure Food and Drugs Act. While the Act gave the Division of Chemistry some regulatory power, its ability to enforce regulation was constantly challenged, and the ever-present wrangling between industry and regulation led to a 1927 reorganization of the Division of Chemistry into the Food, Drug, and Insecticide Organization, which then, in 1930, was renamed the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. A growing consumer movement, pressured by muckraking journalists and events such as the tragic mass poisoning caused by the untested pharmaceutical elixir sulfanilamide that killed 100 people in 1937, pressed Congress to give the FDA significantly more robust powers with the 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The act has been amended many times and today is the center of the Food and Drug Administration's, which today has nearly 15,000 employees and a budget in excess of $5 billion, regulatory power. One of the amendments to the act was driven by James Delaney, a U.S. congressman from New York, who chaired a select committee to conduct an investigation and study of the use of chemicals, pesticides, and insecticides in and with respect to food products. The results of his findings resulted in the 1958 Food Additives Amendment to the Food, Drugs, and Cosmetic Act that was commonly called the Delaney Clause. It read, "The Secretary of the Food and Drug Administration shall not approve for use in food any chemical additive found to induce cancer in man or after tests found to induce cancer in animals." The reasoning behind the strict nature of the Delaney Clause was stated by influential researcher Dr. Wilhelm Huber, who testified before Congress. "I do not believe that one can establish a safe dose of carcinogens," he said. "I do not think that we have the method or evidence available by which we can reliably determine a safe dose." The legislation was undoubtedly well intended, but it would lead to some thorny questions, as we have found out that essentially pretty much anything can give a rat cancer if you give it to them in a large enough dose. And one of the first tests of the amendment had to do with the berry from a dwarf evergreen shrub called Vaccinium macrocarpon, otherwise known as the North American cranberry. Cranberries are naturally hard, sour, and bitter. The name is likely derived from craneberry and is because part of the flower of the shrub resembles the neck, head, and bill of a crane. There are many cranberry varieties in Europe where the name was derived. But the North American berries were introduced to colonists by Narragansett peoples who had harvested wild berries at least from the 16th century, perhaps much farther back. The berries were often ground with dried meats into pemmican, a highly nutritious preserved food that was a significant part of Native American cuisine. The berries were also used for red dyes and due to their astringent qualities in medical poultices. Despite the sour taste, they were recognized fairly early for their nutritional value, with a 1672 book noting they are excellent against the scurvy, a quality derived from their high vitamin C content. The same text noted their sour taste and said that they were generally boiled down with sugar to make a sauce for meat that is a delicate sauce, especially with roasted mutton. To understand how cranberries fit in with the Delaney Clause, you have to understand the unique nature of the fruit. Cranberries grow on trailing vines like a strawberry, but the vines thrive on a special combination of soils and water properties found in wetlands. Cranberries grow in beds layered with sand, peat, and gravel that are commonly called bogs. The bogs were originally formed by receding glaciers, which carved impermeable kettle holes lined with clay. The clay lining prevented materials from leaching into the groundwater, and as the glaciers melted, rocks and organic materials were deposited on top of the clay, creating the ideal environment for cranberries, which require acid peat soil, an adequate fresh water supply, and a growing season that extends from April to November. Wild cranberries of Massachusetts, for example, flower in June and July and are ready to pick by September. North American cranberries were being exported to Europe by the 17th century, and recipes for preserving the berries, as well as making sauces, tarts, and pies, were common in the 18th century in both American and English cookbooks. Still, because of their unique nature, cranberries were still being collected wild, not cultivated. It wasn't until the early 1800s that Henry Hall, a veteran of the Revolutionary War who lived in Dennis, Massachusetts, started to cultivate the berries. Hall noticed that sand blown in from nearby dunes helped vines grow faster. By adding sand in appropriate quantities, per acre yields of berries increased. Modern growers still spread an inch or two of sand on their bogs every 3 years. As the berries grow on vines, the vines do not need to be regularly replanted, and some Massachusetts vines are reputed to be over 150 years old and still producing fruit. Hall's innovations allowed greater production, and a commercial industry grew that, combined with a greater availability of granulated sugar, allowed the fruit to grow in popularity. As it did, it grew in association with the holiday season. The berries were bright, shiny, and red, making excellent decorations. They were harvested and available in winter, and as they are slow to spoil, lasted well through the Christmas season. The season was also known for feasts of roasted meat, which went well with cranberry sauce. Cranberries became so popular that after the Civil War, successful efforts to grow cranberries in New Jersey led to what has been described as a cranberry fever, a rush of investment to grow cranberries that was largely a bust, as the plants are finicky and the people hoping to get rich quick had little understanding of how to actually grow them. Cultivation methods slowly developed, including less time-intensive methods of harvesting. This was largely the result of careful study of growing factors and methods, and the finicky nature of the plant meant that the industry developed growers' organizations early on, which worked not just to help develop growing methods, but to collectively market the product. The success of a century of effort really showed in 1959 when the industry had already become a $50 million a year business. And 1959 looked to be a bumper record crop, 125 million pounds. Growers were expecting to make record profits, and likely they would have, except for the Delaney Clause. The problem was an herbicide called aminotriazole. A chlorophyll inhibitor, aminotriazole, was used by cranberry growers starting in the 1950s to eliminate sedges, rushes, horsetails, and deep-rooted grasses from the bogs, clearing the water for the cranberries. Growers were instructed to use the chemical only after the harvest so as to keep it off the finished fruit, but trace amounts could still exist in extremely small quantities. Manufacturers petitioned the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to allow small amounts of residue, up to 1 part per million if necessary. But the FDA rejected the petition. There was a problem. New research had suggested that large, long-term doses of the chemical suppressed thyroid function in rats, encouraging tumors, possibly cancerous, to form. That made aminotriazole a carcinogen, and while the study suggested that a rat would have to eat a vast quantity of contaminated cranberries over its entire lifespan to increase its risk for cancer, the Delaney Clause said that carcinogens were not acceptable in any amount. When trace amounts of the chemical were found in a part of the cranberry crop just 17 days before Thanksgiving, the reaction by the FDA resulted in the Great Cranberry Scare of 1959. The chemical was found in a few shipments of berries from Washington and Oregon, states which produced a tiny fraction of the annual crop. But strictly reading the new Delaney Clause, and in an abundance of caution, the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, Arthur Fleming, moved to limit the sale of berries from Washington and Oregon until the industry could develop a plan to separate out the contaminated berries. But the true damage came when a reporter asked the Secretary whether a housewife should buy cranberries for her family. Fleming answered that if a housewife wasn't sure of the origin of the product, then, to be on the safe side, she doesn't buy. Suddenly, cranberries were not safe, contaminated with the terrifying-sounding aminotriazole. Despite the fact that only a tiny portion of the crop had tested positive for the chemical, grocery stores pulled cranberries off of shelves, restaurants dropped them from their menus, and some communities banned their sale. Life magazine published a list of alternative dishes, including spiced crab apples, frosted grapes, currant jelly, and beach plum preserve. John Deckus, a cranberry grower from Massachusetts, said on National Public Radio, "We had 40 trailer loads of cranberries canceled within 1 hour after that announcement. My reaction at the time was, oh my God, it's over." Ocean Spray, a cranberry grower cooperative, tried to limit the damage. The executive vice president sent a telegram to Fleming. "We demand that you take immediate steps to rectify the incalculable damages caused by your ill-formed and ill-advised press statements yesterday." There were efforts by politicians as well. Richard Nixon, then vice president and campaigning for president, ate 4 helpings of cranberries on November 12th. That made the headline of the Washington Post the next day. He stood proudly for the berry, saying, "I, like other Americans, expect to eat traditional cranberries with my family on Thanksgiving Day." Not to be outdone, the Democratic nominee, Senator John Kennedy, conspicuously drank 2 glasses of cranberry juice the next day. The Post then noted, bipartisan cranberry consumption. Unconfirmed reports said Kennedy quipping, "If we both pass away, I feel I shall have performed a great public service by taking the vice president with me." This was the first great modern food scare in the nation. It was a time of more powerful media, of a more educated public, of more distrust of corporate motives. People were bombarded with contradictory science and breathless news reports. The FDA tried to limit the damage, creating a testing and labeling program to clear berries before Thanksgiving. But the death blow came Thanksgiving Day, when the First Lady, Mamie Eisenhower, served applesauce instead. The AP headline read, "No cranberries for President." The season was a disaster. The cranberry industry reported $20 million in losses in January. Ocean Spray announced it had laid off 1/3 of its workforce. Sales were 70% below normal for Thanksgiving and 50% below normal for Christmas. The industry needed some $10 million in subsidies just to survive the season. It was also unnecessary. In the end, more than 99% of the crop was found to be uncontaminated, and the few batches that were in minute amounts. Not one person is known to have been harmed by the berries. There's really a mixed legacy for the Great Cranberry Scare of 1959. It did give rise to some consumer advocacy that achieved some important reforms, but also, according to Dr. Elizabeth Whalen of the American Council of Science and Health, the 1959 Cranberry Scare set the stage for decades of completely unnecessary anxiety about trace amounts of agricultural chemicals and additives in food. The cranberry sales rebounded the following year, but the industry learned a valuable lesson. One of the reasons that the scare had been so devastating is that the product was almost exclusively consumed in the short period of the holidays, which made it extremely vulnerable to disruption. Cranberry juice was produced and sold at the time, but it was really actually formulated for the taste of growers, not the general public, and it wasn't marketed by the industry. But with the help of the government and as a result of the cranberry scare, the industry started to create products like cranberry juice cocktails and dried cranberries that made cranberries popular year-round and therefore less vulnerable to disruption. And over time, the industry actually grew. The cranberry crop today is some 7 times what it was in 1959. The industry stopped using aminotriazole altogether, but it's still used in non-agricultural settings, like clearing grasses from highway medians. Over time, the zero-tolerance policy for carcinogens became unsustainable, partly because of the cranberry scare. Testing methods improved, and as New Yorker magazine noted, in the years that followed the cranberry scare, dozens and then hundreds of chemicals would prove carcinogenic in humans or animals. Testing sensitivity increased 1,000,000-fold. Strict application of the law, one researcher noted, undermined the ability of the food and agricultural industries to produce almost any foodstuff that was free of some degree of contamination. More flexible methods of assessing toxicity were needed, and the Delaney Clause was finally fully repealed in 1992, but definitive answers still elude us. Consumers are still caught between advocates in industry, still faced with conflicting science, and still confronted with what seems to be ever more common food scares.
You know, we talked a little bit when we were talking about the sliced bread about this, you know, this huge control over the economy and how much regulation there was and how much we allowed. But in some ways, I mean, there's a lot of regulation and in some ways more regulation today than there was in the 40s. Yeah. And this really shows us, you know, some of the ways that we've gone back and forth in terms of how much is good.
That's really the story of the video on the cranberries, is that right at the beginning, I mean, we weren't really doing food regulation before that. I mean, there was like slaughterhouse regulation and some other things. But I mean, when we first came to this idea that, you know, does the food need to be pure? Do we go? But when you went from buy everywhere to, you know, to government protection, is how do you draw those lines? And so this is a good example of that, because it's a fair question. What is an acceptable amount of carcinogen?
Well, and I think basically even more so, what it brings out is the science of how science has advanced, because they all of a sudden you can test and you can test and test. I'm in the animal health business. I was told many years ago by one of my friends, a veterinarian. He said, you watch, and he said eventually they're going to have to change a lot of the regulations and laws because they can test down to the nano now, and there are a number of things even in nature that are harmful in large amounts or at a particular place, but you have to draw a line on what is actually damaging. Nature puts out, you know, poison mushrooms, all kinds of things too. You have to be realistic about the fact that there is a line there, just like there was in the sliced bread that we talked about. There's a place that you go over, and you have to be so careful about the regulations that you make, because you can eliminate things that are very necessary to the world or are very good in the world, just because now I can tell that they might have something in them that's harmful.
Yeah, this is an example of something that still occurs today, and that was the food scare. That's really what it was. Yeah, which was so interesting. We had a very small percentage of the crop that was contaminated with a very small amount of this chemical. And, you know, to be fair, this chemical, the industry doesn't use this chemical anymore, so it is a dangerous chemical. But because of that, and because the Secretary of Agriculture said, well, if you don't know where it's from, you don't buy the cranberries, then all of a sudden, all of the crop and everything and it nearly killed the entire industry overnight. It hit it right at the time, you know, when that was their big sale for the year. And that, you know, that's farming lives on the edge. You know, you depend upon selling that crop. And just ill timing on it. And a scare that caused a reaction that was much larger than the real threat nearly meant that, you know, you wouldn't buy cranberries today, that the whole cranberry industry might have collapsed. So it's really fascinating to kind of hear how those pieces go together. And it does show that when we think about anything, including government regulation, you have to think through all the consequences. And it was true with sliced bread, and it's true with the cranberry scare as well.
And very definitely about, I'm in the cattle business, and think about BSE. You have a few old cows that are showing a disease, very, very few, shows up in England, and all of a sudden the entire beef business is under really, really strict guidelines type thing. Finally now, 15 years later, I see that they have dropped all the rules again, because basically, and no one was ever really sure that is really where the disease was coming from. Food scares, for those of us, I'll have to be honest, in my business, if something happens to us, then you just hope the turkey people did something really dumber.
Your competitor. Cranberry people hope, crossing their fingers that the orange people sprayed something even worse than them, so the people are stuck with cranberry.
That will save the
It's
cranberry.
interesting that one of the things that they said was stewed crab apples. I don't know whatever happened to the crab apple industry, but I think it would be hard to stew a crab apple these days. I think it would be difficult to find a crab apple to stew.
Yeah, can you buy crab apples? I mean,
I have no idea. If you went in the store for stewed crab apples, I think they'd be hard to come by. So cranberries came out of. It's actually interesting because at the time, cranberries were only really seen at Thanksgiving and Christmas, and they were actually more Christmas than Thanksgiving at the time. And now they've moved to cranberry juice and juice cocktail and those dried cranberries, so that they have a kind of a year round. And that whole story of cranberries is interesting there too. I mean, because that was a totally really an American thing. They're very different in Europe. And then figuring out how to grow them, because they have to grow in a bog, and they had these periods where they were so popular they tried to grow in places where they didn't have bogs and couldn't figure out how to grow them. There's some real interesting stories in that whole episode. It's really kind of a fascinating because it's more than you ever knew about cranberries.
Yeah,
but we're lucky to have them today. They were almost killed by that one scare.
I have to tell this story because it was really funny. One of our relatives older relatives had gone out for Thanksgiving dinner, said that she couldn't tell what she ate because she didn't have her glasses. And I said, well, how about the taste? And she said, no, but she said, I really like that red stuff. Well, you know what the red stuff was, but she wanted her cranberry in a jelly. She wasn't coming out of a can.
So she liked the can. She didn't like fresh cranberries. But it's funny, that's the only thing she could recognize out of Thanksgiving dinner was the cranberries, because all she could see was red. That was a great take. You can tell
that by the color.
That was a great take on Thanksgiving dinner. I asked her if she had enough. She said, I must have had enough, but don't ask me what I ate because I forgot my glasses.
Yeah, it's an interesting, you mentioned, with the Delaney Clause, that conceptually you understand that they're like, we don't want carcinogens in our food. Like that makes sense.
Well, we had just figured out what they were.
Yeah, but you're right that you end up having to toe this line of what is what is safe and what is ridiculous, and that's a hard line it's a hard line to toe sometimes. Yeah. And I think we found this time that it wasn't actually that hard. We were way over the line. The cranberries, hardly any of them had anything in them, and it was really a marketing thing for cranberry. It was just the cranberries. It was a disaster. Yeah. But I think it's funny, that the presidential campaign folks, Nixon and Kennedy, are both like, oh well, we're gonna eat and drink cranberries.
What a cranberry. Kennedy said if it killed him, then he would have done the country a favor by killing Nixon. Yeah, there's some funny. There's some almost just it's weird enough that there's almost just an ironic twist. There's kind of almost an underlying humor about what happened, but it certainly was terrifying to people. They were holding cranberry festivals and had a Miss Cranberry and all this sort of thing, and suddenly their whole the whole industry. The guy, you work all year to bring in your crop, and he had 40 truckloads that were canceled in an hour, and he thought, this whole business that we've had forever is gone. So it's really got that underlying scare there too. Yeah, it's today we can measure to much greater amounts. We can measure much better to see what's in there. But when you first identify carcinogens, you can see why the answer, what's a safe amount? Well, nothing's a safe amount, and so we'll cut out anything. And then it finds out that we gotten to the ability where we can measure them. That that everything, you wouldn't eat anything because everything's got some amount of something that if you feed it to a rat, it's going to give the rat cancer. I don't know how many of those rats survive. That's the
I don't think they're supposed
apparently. To. Yeah, they must all get cancer. That's one of the things that they've also kind of found is that virtually everything has some sort of carcinogen. So it's really it's a story about the beginning of the industry of the government trying to regulate food and trying to understand that. That's interesting. It's a story about the history of cranberries. It's a story even about the presidential election. But it's also a story about how. Again, a small decision, a regulatory decision, can have an outsized impact if you don't really, see the consequence down the line.
It's all. I think we all agree that we want to be able to know that the food we're eating is safe. I mean, we go to restaurants, we want to expect that they're in the back where they're cooking stuff, they're not using rotten foods and stuff like that. And that's, regardless of regulation, we want to be able to expect that. And we've done a couple of episodes that are similar in ways that, the ketchup, history of ketchup and the olive poisoning, both talk about ways that where there was some importance. There's some importance to regulating this stuff, and why we do things the way we do. But it's also interesting that we end up facing this line that, man, if you have essentially one time to like, oh no, there's something that might cause cancer in large amounts, that ruins an entire year of cranberries, that could be enough to literally wipe out cranberry essentially as an industry.
But it's crazy. Also interesting at the time, because some people saw this as abuse of government, saw some of it as abuse of industry. There were some political cartoons that showed the government being the heavy hand, and some political cartoons that showed Big Cranberry. Who knew there was Big Cranberry? But Big Cranberry, was roasting the Department of Agriculture for making a bad choice. So, I mean, I think there were people on both sides. I think there still are today. I don't know that we've answered all the questions that really the cranberry scare raises, because still anybody in the industry is probably going to disagree with anybody in the regulatory environment about what's a safe amount. And people are going to be on both sides of it out in the world. But
well, and it's a fair question, because of course, whatever the safe amounts are, that's if we're talking that means the industry has to change activities or add or take away something. I mean, that's a lot of cost for them, and so you understand why they have. And I think in general the industry doesn't want to kill people.
That's bad for business. Yeah, I mean, I don't think either anybody wants to. And regulators, they don't want to be the ones that didn't regulate something that needed to be regulated. That's a bigger crime than regulating something else. But on the other hand, you also don't want to be the guy that says, well, we don't know, so don't buy, and this is the only time we sell them a year, and it costs the industry billions of dollars.
Well, and it's just there's so much science involved, and it's one of those things that you need to trust the science and know that it's done right, and that is another issue that we see very, very often nowadays too.
Yeah, I had no idea that there's these fields in like Massachusetts where, I mean, at the right time of year, everybody in town would roll out and help pick the cranberries. I had no idea that's how it worked.
Yeah, it's a really interesting. I hadn't thought much about cranberries. They're a little too tart for me in general, but I like cranberry sauce at Thanksgiving, and I drink some cranberry juice and stuff like that. But it is interesting. But of course, as you mentioned, it's kind of interesting to think that a lot of the ways we eat cranberries today, we might owe that in an indirect way
to the cranberry scare,
the scare, because the government was trying to support the industry after they had nearly destroyed it over what was ultimately clearly a scare that was
I think this one we said was unnecessary, that the panic was utterly unnecessary, and that this stuff actually wasn't dangerous. But I mean, it's hard to say too, because the industry no longer uses this chemical. It's used like on highway medians, but I mean the industry won't use it at all. So, but they knew its risk too, because they would use it after the crop had come in. So you're putting it in the fall, and you weren't going to pick it up a crop until the next year, and so they knew that it was a risk. But I mean, these were very, very tiny amounts. So I think in the end they say no one, if they just not said a word, that no one would have gotten sick out of these cranberries.
But it's difficult because with say the olives, people died when they ate those olives, and that's you never know where your
stuff
where the
that
line
was
is,
unregulated killed people. I mean, then is it worth it to be? So do you want to? How do you want to err? They're interesting questions. But again, we lived through the Great Cranberry Scare. We'll live through it again.
Yep. Well, we live through quite a few scares these days, and you wonder sometimes. I mean, they're how sensitive they are to various concerns about whether it's contaminated or not. That's a problem. These days, I think we usually Salmonella and E. coli are usually the scares that we see today. But it's similar stuff that you don't want E. coli, of course, getting out, but you don't want to destroy large amounts of product that is perfectly safe to eat. And I'll admit that whenever I see they're like, oh, don't romaine lettuce might have E. coli, and they'll tell you, what states or whatever that it came from. I'm like, when I'm walking into a store, I don't know where they got that romaine lettuce. And so my choice is usually just to avoid romaine lettuce.
But I mean, that's one of the changes though today is that, they'll be able to tell you what field it came from. Whereas, when the cranberry scare happened, it was very difficult for them to segregate out which part of the crop had come from that part. Now, because we've got ability to track some things like barcodes, which we actually did an episode on, and things like that, give us the ability to track in a way that makes it less likely that a mistake or a contamination in one spot is going to cause the whole industry to collapse. And especially vulnerable would be something like Cranberries, who they're this huge. At the time, I mean, probably roughly 90% of their business was based on that one time a year, and that's when the sales went. So they were particularly vulnerable, but also we've certainly become better able, so that if that were to happen today, we would be better able to identify which lots caused it and where those had gone and get those out of the food supply without affecting the entire cranberry crop.
And to get the dangerous stuff off of store shelves. It is an interesting, and it's always going to be that push and pull between safety and regulation and what the industry wants, what people want, what the government wants. It's just a lot of competing interests, and ultimately
we've seen that in lots of places. We saw that in airline regulation too, on the Piper, on the King's landing and stuff like that, and those. When you mess up, either way, it can be a big mistake. When the industry convinces the regulator that says, "Oh, we don't really have to do a recall," sometimes that leads to bad things. And so, it's good that we have a push and pull. It's good that we see it from both ends, but I don't know that we'll ever find the perfect line. And that's just life. So it wasn't intentional that these two videos were both about overregulation. It wasn't intentional to suggest that we shouldn't be regulating. They were simply both to show foibles of what can happen.
And use common sense no matter what you do.
And good stories. Yeah, good stories to tell.
Yeah. I mean, I think ultimately, the history of regulation is complex, and that's why we have to look at it the way we do. It's hard for us to, and it's only gotten more complex. I mean, it's very hard to know these days, where the stuff you're eating. If you walk into a grocery store, it's hard to know where all that food came from. It could have come from very far away, and there's a lot of stuff that goes into that. And so I understand our needs for governmental regulation, but I also understand the difficulties of making that happen, and also in making sure that I can afford to buy my lettuce, because those regulations are going to add costs somewhere along the line. I mean, those are all those various things that we're talking about, and I think hopefully when we talk about this, we look at how hard a job it is to make sure that we have access to the safe food that we do have access to, and to make sure that it's going to be of good quality and make it to all the places it needs to get to. And truly, it's incredible. It is incredible, the world we live in especially in the United States, how much access we have to stuff, and how safe it is. Usually you can count on.
To be very grateful for, yeah.
No, we can get the fact I could buy raspberries all year round, no matter where they come from. In my day, you had leaf lettuce in the spring. You were so excited you couldn't stand it. And the day that I realized that they were actually selling it in the fall, I'm going, oh my goodness, look at this. And so and that's one of the other things we have to look at. Transportation and communication makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah, it's incredible. I somebody just got me a watermelon for my birthday because I like watermelon, and it's November.
In Wyoming,
I don't know how good a watermelon it's going to be, but tell you what, the simple fact that in Wyoming you can even find a watermelon in November.
But there's less and less food that's truly seasonal. You can get avocados year round now. You can get stuff that when I was a kid you couldn't get year round. You really did worry about seasonal food, and now you can get almost any fruit or vegetable almost any time of the year, and that is astounding. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an incredible thing that we can do, and that's all just thanks to our modern systems. And tell you what, you can count on them a lot. But as we saw with in these episodes, with a little regulation or with COVID, something steps in. Man, the repercussions, the way they ripple out, sometimes unexpected, and that's how we end up where we are. But like you said in the last episode, I mean, I think what we take from this is we've been through worse. Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Forgotten History, and if you did, you can find more on our website, thehistoryguy.com. We release podcasts every 2 weeks, so stick around if you want to hear more podcasts of Forgotten History. You can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Patreon. You can even get a personalized message from the History Guy himself on Cameo.